as the healthcare landscape, looking at the patient footfall recovery. China's patient footfall has actually experienced a strong recovery in both public and private hospitals, even to compared to pre-COVID levels in 2019. And this trend is also consistent through tier 1 to tier 3 hospitals. Demand in China has recovered very quickly this year due to its virus elimination strategy. And especially with the concerns of localized outbreaks, as Adam has mentioned, it will continue to pose future risks to domestic demand. But as long as China continues to take its current approach and it continues to prove successful with its strict lockdown measures, we expect domestic demand for healthcare to remain stable in the following year. And if we look at outpatient and inpatient medical fees, they have experienced a slight shift. The inpatient fees have experienced a slight drop compared to the previous quarter, and the outpatient fees have also experienced a slight increase compared to the last quarter. And it could be due to COVID-19 with these shifts in medical fees, but partially we would also argue that it is influenced by the DRG, DIP provider payment reforms, which we will cover a little bit deeper later on in this webinar. So if we look at the national insurance coverage, there is also an urgency here to actually control the growth of medical fees. As we see here in the adjustments of the national insurance space, there has been relatively stable coverage rates at 70% in the previous few years. But in the recent 2 years, that is in 2019 and 2020, we've actually seen this reimbursement rate drop to about 66%, even before the pandemic. And so one thing it shows that the medical fees are growing at a faster rate than reimbursement rates. And it is also a sign that the government is slowing down its spending on medical fee coverage. And this funding is also shifting to somewhere else, which we will touch on in the policy section. But the national health insurance this year is still experiencing very strong growth, even if we compare it to 2019 levels. The year-on-year growth for both expenditure and income levels are both around 20% higher than 2019 over the same period, and that is from January to May. And therefore, we continue to expect a strong growth in healthcare spending this year and beyond. And this is for both public and private expenditure, and also based on the assumption that COVID doesn't cause too much disruption within China itself. So in this section, we've briefly covered the current healthcare demand trajectory, and that so firms should continue to align expectations within your organization based on China's COVID-19 response and vaccine strategy. We also expect a continued growth in the reimbursement and non-reimbursement spaces as the government continues to focus on the expansion and digitalization of healthcare services. Local teams should also be attuned to frequent hospital fee schedule revisions and understand how that may influence hospital budgets and purchasing decisions. And finally, closely track the growth of private hospitals as commercial insurance and out-of-pocket spending accelerate in the coming years, partially driven by the rising income levels as well as additional policy support. So we'll just pause here to have a polling question to get a little bit of understanding on how your performance expectations have turned out so far. Your answers will strictly remain anonymous. We just want to see what the people in the audience are thinking. So the question that we have is how your 2021 performance compares to your demand planning expectations. It could be much worse than expected, within expectations, better than expected or much better than expected? Okay, great. So, so yes, this is very interesting results. We've seen that it's worse. Most of the results have been selected as worse than expected or within expectations. Um, that is very interesting, especially, but it's understandable because it has been a challenging year, and there has been many circumstances that have happened that's not within expectations. So it is important to align with your teams on growth expectations and set realistic goals that's in line with the market expectations. And so now let me just return back to my slide. So as we know, now moving on to the healthcare policy section, as we know, China is currently undergoing medical reforms in which the government is trying to address certain issues within its healthcare system from three main angles: the medical services, from medical supplies, as well as its own medical insurance system. And so here we have the National Health Commission's reform priorities this year, and it continues to work on those three angles that I previously mentioned. And so these goals are broadly categorized in four areas. First, to continue implementing its Sunming experience. This section includes most of the current hot topics within China, such as group procurements, medical fees, pricing reforms, and developing high quality hospitals. But the key aim here is to shift hospital expenditure from medical supplies towards the medical services itself. We also have the government continuing to improve on its health equity within China, which is essentially the government trying to build a tier-based system that comprises of regional medical centers, as well as broadening primary care coverage. And we see this eventually evolving into something that is very similar and familiar to some people within the Western countries as well, such as an integrated care model. And thirdly, the government will also be investing more into public healthcare systems, which includes budgets to strengthen infectious disease surveillance and chronic disease detection. And finally, the NHC will also collaborate closely together with other government agencies as well as state-owned enterprises to develop digital healthcare tools.